I am touched and delighted and honored to see you here, and very, very grateful. Thank you. This is a real surprise to me, and a delightful honor, as will become evident when we talk a little bit about Sienna, the Pro-Life Center here at the University of St. Thomas that I direct, and what the upcoming pro-life challenges are. So let me begin with sort of recognition that this is the 5th year, and sort of rehearse, if you will, the history of Sienna and its work to establish an authentic understanding of what being female means in the created order, as well as what being male means in that order. The first award went to Sister Mary Prudence Allen, and she's an amazing woman that has a multi-volume work on the concept of woman, and she honored us with her presentation of the integral complementarity of men and women, the Catholic vision. And then in the second year, building on that success, we were fortunate enough to have Helen Alvarez, a person whose name is almost a household word in the area of pro-life action. Helen is a dear friend of mine. She teaches at George Mason, but prior to becoming an academic, she worked for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops as the pro-life spokesperson. And the media just didn't know what to do with this beautiful, brilliant, amazing Hispanic woman who graduated from Columbia Law School. And they still don't. But Helen offered her thoughts on politics, women and the politics of freedom. And then in 2014, Mary Eberstadt came at the invitation of the Sienna Symposium. And those of you who have not read her book, How the West Really Lost God, I would recommend it heartily to you. It's a brilliant work that analyzes the relationship between the loss of faith and the loss of family in a society. And then finally, last year, the symposium was honored to have a presentation by Dr. Janet Smith, who most of you know is probably the foremost scholar in the area of contraception and humanae vitae in particular. But she talked about the real meaning of responsible parenthood. I say this not to seek to bask in reflected glory, although I'm perfectly content to do that, thank you. But to show you sort of the depth of the intellectual commitment that this organization has, and the sort of people they have sought out to bring to this university community to form the thought of young women and young men here at the university. And so when I say with all sincerity that I am more nervous about this talk than any oral argument I've ever given in my life, I'm quite serious, and it's because these are my predecessors. Unlike most appellate courts where you never know who's going to be in front of you. But each of these women brought to us different insights that I want to build on, because each of them identified in order sort of 4 threats to life and liberty. And so when Sister Prudence Allen came and talked to us about complementarity, what she identified for us is gender ideology and the threat that's developing from a false understanding of the physical differences between men and women, but not just physical, but emotional, spiritual, intellectual. The denial of inherent differences, yet equality of the 2 sexes, male and female. My law students present know that, in fact, there's a rather famous Kansas Supreme Court opinion that says that in order to define the sex of an individual, there are 8 different tests. And then, of course, there's the famous article that argues that there are 6 different genders. All right. So Sister Prudence Allen's whole scholarship that she's been called to is to think about what does it mean to be a woman, and is to be a woman simply mean not to be a man, in which case that's sort of a paltry definition, right? Don't we have our own identity beyond that? And if it does, what does that identity mean? Why did God create us in 2 sexes? Why aren't we asexual animals, sort of thing? And that's something that has great implications for the pro-life movement, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then She was followed by Professor Helen Alvarez, who gave an amazing talk about women and the politics of freedom. And what she identified as the threat that we face as a community, as a society, dare say, as an international community, is this idea that the freedom of women equals unlimited sexual expression with no baby, and is usually linked with no relationship between the sexual partners, and anyone who opposes this view is an enemy of women. And she rehearsed all of the claims of those of us who believe that human sexuality finds its authentic expression in a committed relationship of self-gift between husband and wife that generates the next generation, and that committed relationship has to endure for life insofar as possible, because we undertake the great blessing and obligation to raise the next generation. Don't look at me, daughter. And then the third amazing speaker, Mary Eberstadt, a scholar of great magnitude who, in addition to how the West really lost religion, wrote a wonderful book about Adam and Eve and the pill that understands at a tremendous depth how our relationship between men and women will be influenced by the neutering of one sex or both sexes, which is accomplished in that way. And she warned us about the intentional degradation of the natural family and of religion as societal unifying forces, that as we denigrate the family, we will therefore see a decline of religiosity. And while that term perhaps no longer has the cachet that it would have had in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, or even, dare I say, the 90s, because of concerns about fundamentalism in certain religious traditions and communities that have turned violent. The simple fact is that all of the empirical research about religion shows that overall, in general, it is a force for good. It is a socially stabilizing force in the community. And just as the family overall, in general, is a force that stabilizes society and allows us to go forward in a way that progresses with healthy children and healthy families and care for our elderly, et cetera. And then last year's speaker, Janet Smith, who is just an amazing woman, a dear friend who has spent the last couple of years in service to her mother. Those of you who don't follow Janet, I strongly recommend you do, simply because she talks a lot about BAM, beloved aged mother, and BAD, beloved aging daughter, and their relationship when BAD and BAM get together. And she talks about that whole gift of experience as you assist that person or those people who brought you into the world and who they themselves cared and looked over and protected you as you matured and came into adulthood, and the blessing as well as the obligation to do that for our aging parents as they go forward. And she talked about the danger of recasting marriage and parenting as means of self-expression rather than a gift of self to others, recalling, of course, the pontificate of the great Saint John Paul II. And so this is the lineage that I step into tonight, which explains why I am terrified and humbled and honored to be a part of it, and hope that I can contribute something to it. So let's look at each of these threats in the context of the pro-life movement and the challenges that we see to the pro-life movement. Let's begin with Sister Prudence Allen's warning that we're going to see a rejection of sexual differences. And it's true that we've seen that in educational opportunities, in occupation, and in the legal definition of status. Now, the most obvious current debate on this question of whether there are authentic sexual differences or whether they're simply a matter of plumbing and self-identification is, of course, what are known as the bathroom wars. In fact, this afternoon, I had been invited to testify, as had other members of the audience, about the question of whether or not that we should have a state law that ensures that the biological identity of an individual will determine whether or not they enter public restrooms, et cetera. The St. Paul Public Schools are engaged in a intense debate about whether self-identification of a student should trump the biology of that student and allow them access to showers and bathrooms, et cetera. And it's a deeply political question right now, and it's a hotly debated question. Sister Prudence Allen said that this was the sort of thing that we would see if we refused to accept that there is something true and authentic about our biology, and that truth evidence itself in our desires and in the way we approach the world. John Paul II, of course, also echoed this and talked about authentic feminism, the feminine genius that comes from the fact that it is women who bear the next generation within our very bodies. I often have said to our children, heart of my heart, I bore you under my heart for 9 months. How can I not love you? How can I not know you in a particularly intimate way? That your father, wonderful, giving, masculine role model that he is in our home, will never know because he never carried you in his body. There is something about the feminine physiology that gives us a connectedness and relationship to those within our families and in the greater world. We bear the burden of sensing in a different way the sorrows of those who are in poverty, who are in danger, the refugee, while men bear the burden of protector, of being separate during that process, but ensuring the process can go forward, of making sure that all that is necessary for that woman and child to flourish is available. They bear a great responsibility, a responsibility that too often our society in today's times has denigrated. Too often in our society in today's time has said that we are simply functional equivalents. And those good fathers, those good husbands are not praised enough in American society. And so she warned us that we have to understand that there's an equality deeper than simply we all get to vote, we all can be firemen, we all can be law professors, we all can be doctors, we all can drive ambulances. There's a Berenstein Bear's book about he bear, she bear that talks about, I can paint a house and I can drive a nail and I can fly a plane. And the idea that we all have those sorts of career or occupational opportunities doesn't get to the authentic equality that necessarily arises from the fact that we are all children of God. But in a society that increasingly rejects natural law and increasingly rejects any argument grounded on intelligent design, and certainly any argument grounded in divine design, that there are differences that should not diminish our dignity but should enhance it, that should draw us closer together rather than separate us and put us in competition. That is what Sister Prudence Allen warned us of. In America, men are excluded from the decision about whether a pregnancy should continue or terminate, even when they are the father of the child. Justice Alito almost didn't get confirmed for the United States Supreme Court because in the lower court case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, he actually said that under the Pennsylvania law that said a husband should be notified if his wife is considering abortion, that was a lawful and constitutional requirement. It was lawful and constitutional in Justice Alito's concept because there were a number of exceptions. So the woman could simply inform her doctor, no public authority, her doctor in the privacy of the examination room, this child is not my husband's. This child was conceived in rape. I am a victim of abuse, or one of my family members will bear the burden of this. There were a number of exemptions, but the general presumption that husbands and wives who create children together have an obligation to undertake together the care and protection of that child. that presumption was ruled unconstitutional in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And on the strength of what? On the strength of a limited evidentiary record where a single social worker testified about abuse, and that women too often are too afraid to even tell their health care provider about it. Instead, we set aside the husband's right to know. And when we think about the abusive household, perhaps it seems the more sympathetic argument, but let me posit a different hypothetical. We are told that we are coming out of the second Great Recession. And yet we know within our own families and in our own circle of friends, men who have been out of work for a number of years. It is quite possible that when a husband and wife conceive a child and it looks like their economic circumstances are desperate and dire, that on the very eve of the husband coming home and saying, "I got the job. I got it. I start on Monday," that his wife, not wanting to burden him with the decision, will make the lonely decision by herself that this family cannot accommodate another child. In the absence of authentic conversation, authentic desire, the simple fact is too often mistakes are made. And yet, as a constitutional principle, our community has now said, men have no right to know. I used to give a talk for the Federalist Society that I no longer give because I'm afraid the idea is becoming quite corrupted and too contrary to what I hoped the outcome would be, because in fact, American law is very consistent across the country that a man who engages in sexual conduct that results in the creation of a child will bear responsibility through the form of a paternity action for that child, regardless of the intentions that surrounded the sexual activity. So they're often called the failed contraception cases, or the cases of situations where men have actually been seduced. There are reported cases where minors who had adult women babysitters who have been taxed with continued paternity, even though there was a 20-year difference between the woman who conceived and the child that is the father of the child. So the law is very clear that men's responsibilities are not excused from any responsibility based on the woman's conduct, that paternity is an absolute obligation of men. And when I used to lecture about that and posit it in contrast to the woman's responsibility to support and nurture the child, too often the law students would say, well, that's wrong. Men ought to be able to get out of it too. And we now have our first legislative proposal in the country to make it that way exactly. That men ought to be able to get out of it too. So the abortion debate even is influenced by the rejection of a belief that men and women have equal responsibilities for the new lives that they create. And certainly it's influenced our definition of marriage, it's influenced our idea of what the proper context for childbearing is. The surrogacy debate too often centers on, if we don't allow surrogacy, if we don't allow the commercialization of women's bodies in impoverished countries, how on earth can same-sex couples ever have children? That has been the linchpin of defeat after defeat after defeat of anti-surrogacy legislation in the country because of a rejection of sexual differences. Helen Alvarez talk that freedom equals sexual expression and childlessness. That talk, of course, is best exemplified by the debate in last night's legislative hearing before the Health and Human Services Reform Committee in this very state. The simple proposal that state funding for women's health care give priority to and be directed to health care centers that provide the full panoply of services for women that include not only contraceptive care, but prenatal care, that include not only treatment for sexually transmitted diseases, but also early motherhood care like lactation assistance. That argument fell on deaf ears as far as the debate went. Our own Commissioner of Health appeared, and ignoring the fact that a substantial portion of state funding is directed only toward those clinics that provide nothing but STI and contraceptive care as a general rule, leaving less money available for the full health care clinics that provide prenatal care. Ignoring that fact, he argued that the system works well for the women and that the real purpose of this funding is to ensure that we lower unintended pregnancies among the poor. And then legislators joined the argument to make the point that the real purpose behind this was to ensure that we didn't have the need for prenatal care, because we know that people who use these sorts of services are invariably involved in drug use or in some sort of abusive relationship and unable to adequately parent these children. And then how will we ever pay for the children of the poor? It was an odd déjà vu from the original arguments that we heard in the 1940s and 50s that insisted that we needed public funding for contraception, when the Ford Foundation said that the cause of World War II was in part because of population growth, and when Minnesota had such an enthusiastic eugenics program in this state. Because our real purpose isn't to facilitate the growth and flourishing of families, it's to make sure that the poor don't have too many children. And that influences the abortion debate as well, and the marriage debate. Because we know with certainty throughout the country that women who are in stable married relationships do not seek out abortion in general. There are those rare cases where it occurs, but the vast majority of abortions in this country are single women, and too often they are seeking out abortion because the father of their child, and that's a phrase you rarely hear in the abortion clinics, but the father of their child has been persuaded in society to say, it's up to you. I'll accept whatever decision you make. And in theory, these are the stand-up guys. These are the guys who are willing to take responsibility. They're the ones who are willing to say, I'll accept whichever decision you make. How do you hear that? Except, I don't want you and this child, but I'll man up if I have to. We have persuaded ourselves that sex is recreational, and that when those consequences that God has created by our very biology arise, that we as masters of the universe should decide between life and death. And that it is the woman who, isolated in her splendor, should make the decision. And how many of those women would be in a very different position if, in fact, their sexual partner, as typically identified in government surveys, aka the father of their child, simply said, I love you, it's a surprise, we'll make it work, let's go tell our folks. How different that sounds. And yet our society, as Helen says, through government policy, as we saw in last night's hearing, and we see at the national level, has persuaded itself that contraception, Title X, those funds are absolutely necessary for the continuation of the American life in our society. The contraception fight is a part of this. Why is it that the National Institute of Medicine determined that all FDA-approved contraception was necessary to women's well-being, but full payment for insulin for diabetics is not? How did we get to a place where our medical leaders believe that contraception is more important than other aspects of health that are life-threatening? And yet, the contraceptive mandate takes as gospel that contraception is good for women, necessary for women, and we must force it to be available to all women. Why? Because we know that self-discipline and the exercise of self-restraint simply cannot be relied on. And we certainly can't allow them to make their own decisions about whether or not contraception is something they desire. In fact, the World Health Organization, when it estimates unmet contraceptive need, simply takes the number of women of reproductive age, which is generally defined between ages 12 through 50, and says all of those women need contraception. Even if you're pregnant, you need contraception. Even if you're sterile, you need contraception. Even if you don't want it, like many of our African countries, which I must say, I'm increasingly persuaded that we're going to be evangelized by Africa, and that is our best hope. But even in those countries who have traditions and religious practices that celebrate big families, that desire large families, even those countries, the World Health Organization presumes that every woman of reproductive age needs contraception. Helen's right. We have inscribed into our Constitution and are inscribing as fast as we can into international and local law the idea that authentic freedom for women can be achieved only if we deny their capacity for childbearing, or at least give them the control of it through contraception, as the argument is made by them. But too often, that control is not the woman's, as St. John Paul warned us. And as Pope Paul warned us in Humane Vitae. Too often, the accessibility of contraception leads to the abuse and disempowerment of women. I just filed an expert witness report for a state in which the question was, should parents be involved in their minor daughter's decision to obtain abortions? And I reviewed the number of cases in which we find that young girls are being taken for contraception by adult men so that they can enjoy sexual activity with them, even though there's no long-lasting commitment to their well-being. And when that fails, then taking them to the abortion clinic. This idea that women's freedom equals unlimited sexual expression and childlessness is simply false, and yet it is inscribed into our national health care plan, it's inscribed into our law. Mary Eberstadt's argument that we have begun to see religion and family as the enemy is very clear through a number of cases. Let me begin with a case that was filed just last month on the 17th of March, the ACLU versus the Administration for Children and Families. Now, this is a reprise of an earlier case that they had filed in Massachusetts, but essentially the ACLU is suing the Administration for Children and Families, as well as HHS generally, for the granting of funds to the Catholic Church for the services they provide to the victims of human trafficking. They are arguing that the Catholic Church is not a lawful recipient of funds allocated for the care of the victims of human trafficking because the Catholic Church does not provide all reproductive health options. Because the Catholic Church, the institution that has the largest network of shelters, the largest network of private colleges, the largest network of private schools, the largest network of private hospitals. The Catholic Church, with all the resources that have been built by our forefathers and foremothers, we are unworthy to assist the government in the care of these victims because we don't think victims of human trafficking need abortions or contraceptions. That eliminates any of the other benefits that we can offer them. And in fact, federal regulations specifically say that in order to apply to participate in these programs, that you have to identify alternative sources for contraception and for abortion, this reproductive health services, if you are going to be eligible. But in this particular case, looking at the tremendous resources that the church brings to help people, because frankly, we've been doing that since our founder established us, which is a little longer than this country's been in existence. But all those resources count for naught because, by golly, we know what these children and women, and it is largely children and women, need more than anything, which is contraception and abortion. We lost the first case against the ACLU in Massachusetts on this issue. But we went up to the Court of Appeals, and in the Court of Appeals, the grant had ended. And so the court said, we don't want to answer this question. So this case disappears. Thank you. Goodbye. Let me jump ahead to the Ziblack case, which is really the Little Sisters of the Poor case, which many of you are familiar with. It is the same thing that the Supreme Court is trying to do here. The Supreme Court, in the absence of Justice Scalia, is looking to the question of whether they must rule on whether the Little Sisters of the Poor must facilitate access to contraception, including abortifacient contraception, to their employees and to those who depend on them. And this case is a wonderful example of something that I tell my students every year, and that those of you who I talked with earlier are familiar with. It's the principle that facts tell and stories sell. The idea that in an election year, we're going to have a Supreme Court say to a group of nuns in full habit who serve the elderly at no cost to them, you have to have contraception because you know you need it, is a stunning possibility. In fact, as one author said, if a group of Hollywood writers had gotten together to think about what would be an interesting movie to produce, they would reject this script, right? Because it is so far-fetched. And yet, based on the oral argument, it is quite clear that 3 of the justices, and I am sad to report all women, 3 of the justices are quite prepared to do this, are quite prepared to have that picture on the national media, because the argument is that all they have to do is tell the Department of Justice that they have an objection and let us use their insurance company. In trying to explain it to my students, I gave them this example. Assume that a married friend of yours who has owns a half interest in a vacation home that you co-own, said to you, I want to take my girlfriend away for a weekend. Now, I know we were planning on you using the lake house that weekend, and I don't want my wife to know. I'm telling her I'm going to a business meeting. All you have to do is not go that weekend that you'd planned to go. My students understand the Little Sisters of the Poor argument. You don't get to use our lake house with my knowing for that purpose, and I'm not going to facilitate it by simply not showing up, which is what they're asking the Little Sisters of the Poor to do. Don't show up, and we'll take care of it. We'll use your lake house, but we'll take care of it. Even Justice Breyer, who is normally not on our side, was troubled by this. And even though every lower court opinion basically said, all you have to do is say the words, is not a substantial burden, except in the Eighth Circuit. Thank you, Eighth Circuit judges. The court accepted it was a substantial burden and tried to get the government to explain why it was so necessary for the Little Sisters of the Poor and all the rest of the plaintiffs in these cases, including evangelical universities and Catholic universities and medical groups and various other nonprofits, why they had to say, I don't want to do it, but you can use my insurance policy. Even Justice Breyer couldn't understand that. So how do I explain this very unusual 2-page order that came out just last week? It came out because the court doesn't want to decide the case. And so what they did in a remarkable move is say to the Department of Justice, tell us how this can be done where these nuns don't have to be involved. And Little Sisters of the Poor, you get a chance to respond on whether it really will work or not, whether it answers your objection. The Supreme Court rarely does these sorts of public settlement conferences, which is essentially what it looks like. The lawyers in the room have many times had district court judges take you into chambers and say, counsel, I don't think you're going to like the outcome of this case. I think you ought to settle. But the Supreme Court doesn't do that. In fact, in Roe versus Wade, they specifically reached out and kept a case alive because they wanted to answer it. The fact that they issued this order tells us that there's a very good chance that if forced to answer it, Justice Breyer will come our way. And then we'll have a 5-3 opinion that covers all of the country, and all nonprofits motivated by religious beliefs will be free of this onerous obligation. Or at least that's my prayer and hope. And then Planned Parenthood versus Alaska. In case after case after case, the court has treated the family as nothing more than a supply provider for children. They are consistently usurping the rights of parents to direct the upbringing of their children. Now, the classic case in which the parents won is J.R. versus Parham, a case in which arose out of California. A child was psychologically ill, and his parents, in conjunction and consultation with the doctors, decided the child would benefit from institutionalized care. And so the child was placed in a mental health institution for treatment and care. And a lawsuit was brought claiming that because the child had not consented, the parents had no right to restrict his freedom in this way. And the United States Supreme Court, in a majority opinion, said, no, it's the parents who bear the burden of raising this child, and it's the parents who the government has always recognized are the primary caretakers and have the right and obligation to make decisions, educational, medical, financial, etc. And yet, when we reach the question of abortion, the case suddenly shifts and the court no longer is willing to trust parents to guide their children in these decisions. And in fact, in the case of contraception, the United States Supreme Court in Carey versus International Population has suggested that parents must also be excluded from the decision of the child whether to use or obtain contraception. Go back to Helen Alvarez's thread. The idea that freedom means unlimited sexual expression with no resulting children. Minors don't have the right to make a plethora of important decisions. When we moved from Texas to Minnesota, our children didn't have a vote. When we decided that they would go to Catholic schools, our children didn't have a vote. When we decided that they were not wearing certain things to school, they tried to have a vote, but they didn't. And yet, on this life-changing decision whether to continue or terminate a pregnancy, or whether to engage in sexual conduct and use contraception, the court has said the parents have no role to play. Or at most, we can be advisor. The language of the court in the Danforth opinion was, there cannot be a parental veto. We can be consultants, but not decision makers. So our church is excluded from helping victims of human trafficking. Parents are excluded from helping their children. And we wonder why the society is experiencing the despair and the violence that we see. And then finally, the thread of self-expressionism is the foundation of marriage. Time and time again, throughout the debate about the nature of marriage, the question came up about whether marriage was that deep union of biological, emotional, and intellectual complementarity, or merely the latter two. Whether it was sufficient that two men or two women were willing to bring together their lives in a union that was mutually supportive. And in a decision that was 5-4 from the United States Supreme Court, the debate on that question was foreclosed. The government said there can be no dissent on this question. Every state in the union, regardless of whether states have voted pro or con. In Minnesota, we lost the constitutional battle and the legislative battle, but at least we did it the right way. At least we had a vote. But the Supreme Court decided that American people were not trustworthy in this. What are the implications of that for the pro-life movement? Again, the question becomes the bearing and raising of children. Surrogacy is demanded not for those infertile couples that are husband and wife, as much as for those couples that are unable to conceive because they're the same sex. We are looking at questions of marriage in that context, but even more compellingly in the question of divorce and the failure to even form marriages in this state and in this country. We are fast approaching a point where 40% of all births in this country are to single mothers. And we know, even though many of those women exert heroic efforts to raise their children well, they do so with great difficulty because there's only one of them. There's no one to call when you have to work late. There's only one of you when the baby's sick and needs to stay home. There's only one of you who can split the labor of maintaining a household. And that happens both through the failure to form families as well as through divorce. And so what Janet Smith taught us last year was that that intrinsic connection between family and new life, once broken, will have tremendously adverse consequences for our society. And we are seeing it today. Without a doubt, the ability to welcome new life is influenced by having a community that supports and welcomes that new life with you. And more importantly, having a partner in intimacy that will assume part of that responsibility. I return to the point that in Minnesota, abortion among married women is very rare. But women who are single are the primary people who search out this ability to end that new life. So how do we address the issue? How do we persuade the new generation, the young people, our law students, our undergraduates, that marriage is a worthwhile endeavor and that childbearing is a worthwhile endeavor? Because it's hard. And it's really hard in the shadow of the law that says marriage is nothing but a voluntary association that can be terminated at any basis. My writing assignment for my students 2 years ago was a Catholic prenup. Thankfully, we don't have any priests present because they would inform me, of course, there is no such thing. But the premise of it was that a Catholic couple, a young man and a young woman, come together and say, we want a sacramental marriage, and we know the pressures of modern society. We know that there are so many people out there who don't believe in us and don't believe in marriage. What we're going to do is we're going to bind ourselves in such a way that if either of us ever files for divorce, we agree here and now that the person filing forfeits all spousal support and all marital assets, leaving child support intact. Now, they were of equal economic power. They were college educated. They both had good jobs. They both had property in the hypothetical. And they both had legal counsel who drafted the agreement. And the agreement was intended to strengthen their will, to strengthen their determination that even in those times, well, murder's a forgivable sin and remarriage is really hard in the church. Okay, but even in those times, when you are so tired and think it's too hard, that there'd be a price to pay. And to a person, every one of my students came to the conclusion that agreement would be legally unenforceable. Why? Represented by counsel, legally competent, well-educated, propertied adults who voluntarily chose and explained with good cause why they wanted this agreement. They wanted to bind themselves to the mast, as Chris Wolfe says in his famous essay on this question, so that no one could put asunder what they themselves voluntarily bound. And yet the courts in this country have decided that marriage is nothing that people should be bound to involuntarily. So even if they have made that agreement, looking at the precedent, the students were persuaded, and I was persuaded, that the agreement would fail, that the courts will no longer enforce lifelong marriage, and in many states will not even provide a division of property that reflects fault. How does that influence the divorce? How does that influence the abortion decision? Because studies are beginning to show us that couples who think their marriages aren't stable will intentionally avoid conception. And certainly the studies of women who come to the abortion clinics and give their reasons indicate their male partner's unwillingness to be there and be present and partner with them in raising this child influences their decision. If we abandon marriage, we abandon children. And it's just too risky to have kids today, so many of my young people say. So what are the solutions? Well, the Siena Symposium is one of them, and the Prolife Center. The Siena Symposium, with its commitment to scholarship, but more importantly, in my estimation, education of the young students, every student that Deborah touches, and Mary and Kathy and Lisa at the law school and Jeannie at the business school, all of those students see and hear an understanding of the world that is grounded in truth and reality in a way that they do not see in the media. And they see lives lived with a commitment to that. They see adoption, the generosity of bringing children into your home that are not your own in this group. They see parenting while doing the two-career tango. They see an abundance of generosity with the birth of an additional child. They come to our home and they see the grandchildren on the mantle, but never in the house. No. They hear in class the stories of the love we have for our families. They hear and see women who live lives of faith and commitment. They see women who pride themselves on the fact that they love their families and that their families love them. They see women living out the gospel. Siena Symposium is a hugely important enterprise, in part because it is set in an academic setting. I will say that there are times when the University of St. Thomas is certainly not Catholic enough for me. Many of you know that. Many of you have heard my grumbling on that. But the fact is, we are a unique and special place because of the faculty ventures like Siena Symposium, because we actually have a pro-life center where students have the opportunity to work on briefs to the U.S. Supreme Court on abortion. They have the opportunity to help form testimony, like the legislative testimony I presented last night. They have the opportunity to go to the United Nations and represent the church's teaching about faith and family and the beauty of life and the importance of the first 1,000 days from the moment of conception through those early and formative years. This is a special and wonderful place, and I am humbled and honored to be a part of it, but particularly to be a part of the group of brave women who formed this before I came, and the men who join us, the men like Bob Kennedy and others who are present here tonight. I'm very grateful for all of them and for all of you who came. And with that, I will